World War II took place from 1939 to 1945 and was the deadliest conflict in human history, with over 70 million lives being lost. And although its conclusion in 1945 brought an end to the war, there was still the major issue of how to deal with Germany after the war to prevent many future issues in the European region. On February 4, 1945, the Allied leaders met in Yalta, a city in the Crimean region of the Soviet Union. The war was looking positive for the Allies, and were expecting a German surrender in the near future. The main focal point of the meeting was on how to handle Germany after the war to prevent another uprising in the region. The three leaders of the conference were Franklin D. Roosevelt, who represented the United States, Winston Churchill, who represented Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, who represented the Soviet Union. Each country had separate goals that they wanted to achieve during the meeting. For instance, the United States wanted the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan a few months after Germany had surrendered, and for the Soviets to join the United Nations. But although things looked good at first glance, it would later be seen that the Soviets had the plans of their own that would soon spark tension after the war. One of the major accomplishments of the Yalta Conference was the division of Germany, with their four zones of control being governed by the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. This would keep law and order in the region, and its future would be determined by the Committee on Dismemberment of Germany. But although this seemed like a positive action of keeping peace in Europe, and was for a while, tension later grew due to the ways of governing each region and the different motives between the eastern and western countries of Europe. For example, Germany was promised free elections in their section of Germany by Russia, a promise that was never kept and angered many people in the West. Instead, the Russian-controlled section of Germany were controlled by the communist leaders who were approved by Joseph Stalin, and they later installed a communist form of government in eastern Germany. And while this may seem like a great deal, in which it was, there were many other events that happened later on that sparked more tension in Europe and almost brought them to the brink of another great war.
After the conference is when many problems arises that would lead to the beginning of the Cold War. Many countries in the West weren't a big fan of the communist Soviet Union. And this was to the point where the US and Great Britain generals started planning for Operation Unthinkable, which would have been a full scale invasion of Russia. Luckily, this never became a reality, but this period of great tension between the Soviets and countries in the West became more and more pervasive. As mentioned before, one of the main issues for conflict between the Soviet Union and other allies, such as the US, is how they thought they should run their territories that they controlled. The United States believed in democracy and wanted free election in West Germany. But in East Germany, the Soviet Union wanted was communist and didn't believe in democracy. And as mentioned before, Russia's broken promises of these elections led to a much tension between the West. But this was only a small issue compared to what happened in Poland. Like Eastern Germany, Poland was promised free elections and a more broadly based government. But all the initial leaders were swiftly replaced by communist leaders approved by the Soviet Union. This caused much more tension in the US and the Soviets due to the lack of trust between the two. By 1945, World War II had come to an end, but it began to look like there would be another right around the corner. The Soviet Union had become very aggressive, and it became so prevalent that Winston Churchill stated that the Soviet problem was growing and needed to be stopped, and also described Russia as an iron curtain that had came down across Europe. By 1949, all the governments in Eastern Europe except Yugoslavia were hardline Stalinist regiments, and countries in Western Europe began to fear that their nation would succumb to the Soviet aggression.
As mentioned previously, Joseph Stalin brought many promises and deals that were formed during the Yalta Conference, and one of these was the Declaration of Liberating Europe. The deal stated that the people of Europe could create their own democratic institutions of their own choice, and also promised the earliest possible establishment through free election governments responsive to the will of the people. Joseph Stalin broke this promise by persuading the countries of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and many other countries to construct communist governments instead of letting the people form their own. And these nations became known as Stalin's satellite nations. After the Yalta Conference, tensions between the US and Soviet Union were steadily on the rise, and each country was beginning to run different plans behind each other's back. Amid this high tension and schemes, the U.S. received valuable information from its ambassador in Moscow in the message known as the Long Telegram that was sent to the U.S. Secretary of State in 1946. George F. Kennan, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, warned that the Soviets thought there could be no peaceful coexistence between communism and capitalism, and that the Soviets desired the relentless expansion of not only their own borders but communism as a whole. He advised the U.S. that the only way to handle their relations with the Soviet Union was a policy of containment, which was blocking the advancement of the Soviet regime and communism everywhere in the world. The U.S. government used Kennedys idea of containment, which became the basis of U.S. foreign policy throughout the rest of the 20th century. In the years following the Yalta Conference, tensions were still very high between the Soviet Union and the countries of Western Europe and the United States. Communism was expanding rapidly throughout Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, and war was appearing to be around the corner until 1953. That year, Joseph Stalin died at the age of 73, and he had led the Soviet Union since 1928. However, his death did lead to a decrease in tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. For example, Austria regained its freedom and became an independent nation after the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from the country. The next year, the new leader of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, in Geneva denounced Joseph Stalin and his old policies at the 20th Communist Party conference. After the summit between him and President Dwight Eisenhower in Geneva, the Soviet Union announced to reduce its army by 600,000 troops, and he also called for a peaceful coexistence between the East and the West. But this relaxation of economic and political control caused problems in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Germany in 1953, communist leaders tried to raise working hours without raising wages, and riots broke out in East Berlin. Almost 3 million East Germans fled to the west part of the country. To halt the people from moving, a wall was built in 1961 to separate East and West Germany. Also in Poland, citizens demanded the removal of Soviet officers from the Polish army. They rioted in 1956, which caused over 100 demonstrators to be killed due to Soviet authorities trying to suppress the riots. In conclusion, the Yalta Conference can be seen as a success and a failure. It did help end the war sooner by having the Soviet Union enter the war against Japan and help keep peace in Europe by preventing another German uprising. This was the case for a while until the Soviet Union broke promises that were made during the conference. For example, they promised free election in its controlled areas, but instead they installed a communist government. This almost caused a domino effect of different issues in Europe, which caused an increase in tension between the Soviet Union and the US, which ultimately led to the start of the Cold War. So while the Yalta Conference had great intentions and did keep peace in Europe for a while, in the long term it seemed to only cause more problems and deteriorated the peace in Europe over time.